Lachen, lachen samach lipi, vayager kevodi av besari. Yishkon alavetav ki lo tazov nafshi lishon lo titen chasidecha lirot shachar todieni anachayim sova simachot et hanecha neimot biminecha netzach. That was from Psalm 116. Good afternoon. My name is Richard Yaffe, and I'm honored that the Rachlis family has asked me to officiate this afternoon as we pay tribute to Ruth Rachlis. On behalf of the family, first of all, thank you all for being here. Ruthie passed away Sunday morning, December the 17th, in her home at the Shaftesbury. She turned 91 1 week ago today, on December the 12th. Ruth was the devoted wife of her beloved Harry, her husband of over 69 years. She was the loving and much loved mother of Michael Rachlis and Debbie Copes, of Fred Rachlis, who passed away in 1993, and of Vivian Rachlis. She was the adoring grandmother of Linus Rachlis, Lila Copes, Sarah Thompson, and Samuel Thompson. And Ruth also leaves many admiring nieces, nephews, cousins, relatives, friends, and colleagues. Great courage in the face of danger. That's how the Oxford Dictionary defines valor. At a service honoring a Jewish woman, the passage to which most of us default is Eshet Chayil from Proverbs. The Hebrew Eshet Chayil, or in Yiddish Eshes Chayil, translates to a woman of valor. Some feminists have challenged the relevance of this prayer, which praises the woman as a wife, as a homemaker, and emphasizes her value to her husband and her children. For me, the prayer is equally powerful in extolling the virtues of compassion, strength of character, commitment, gentleness, and kindness, and captures the essence of Ruth Rachlis. A woman of valor, who can find? She is more precious than fine pearls. Her husband trusts in her, and so he lacks nothing. She does him good, never harm, all the days of her life. She perceives that her labor is rewarding. Her candle burns into the night. She reaches out to those in need and extends her hand to the poor. She is clothed in strength and dignity. and she faces the future cheerfully. She speaks with wisdom. The law of kindness is on her lips. Her children rise up and bless her. Her husband sings her praises. Many daughters have done valiantly, but you excel them all. As I was preparing for today's service, I was astonished when I realized that I've known Ruth and Harry for over 45 years. Our initial connection was through Temple Shalom, where Ruth sang soprano in my choir for decades. That evolved into a friendship with the entire Rachlis family, and it saw our families supporting each other through the best of times and through the worst of times. And it was then that Harry began to refer to me lovingly as his spiritual leader. When I met my partner John over 18 years ago, we were delighted to learn that each of us independently was a friend of the Rachlis family. And when Ruth and Harry generously extended an invitation to my mom and to me to attend their annual Passover Seder in, I think, 2001, I was intrigued to learn that John, sometimes with his kids, had already been attending their Seder for a few years. And all of us were always made to feel right at home. Ruth had the ability to connect. She could engage in conversation with my parents or with John's kids with the same ease and interest as she could with John and me. She saw each person as an individual, as someone of worth, as someone deserving of respect. She was practical and pragmatic. The theme of helping others, particularly those in need, underscored all of her actions. I remember when Ruth phoned me and gracefully and graciously asked me to forgo the annual floral arrangement I used to send each year for the Rachlis Seder, and suggested that we instead donate to the Moas Chitim Fund at Jewish Child and Family Services. And in another very typical act of generosity, when my mum died 4 years ago, Ruthie was among those who gathered the troops and helped to coordinate meals for our family during Shiva. Imagine my reaction when my cousin Kenny in Detroit, Michigan called me to say that a friend of mine from Winnipeg named Ruth had called him to Detroit to ask if he would contribute to a meal. But that was Ruth. In her own quiet, gentle way, she made a difference. And all of us are the beneficiaries of her acts of loving kindness. The light of life is a finite flame. Like the Sabbath candles, life is kindled, it burns, it glows, it is radiant with warmth and beauty. But soon it fades, its substance is consumed, and it is no more. In light we see, in light we are seen, the flames dance and our lives are full. But as night follows day, the candle of our life burns down and gutters. There is an end to the flames. We see no more and are no more seen. Yet we do not despair, for we are more than a memory slowly fading into the darkness. With our lives we give life. Something of us can never die. We move in the eternal cycle of darkness and death, of light and life. I'm going to ask Ruth's grandson, Samuel Thompson, to say a few words.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. My name is Samuel Thompson, and Ruth was my baba. And I'd just like to share a few stories on behalf of Ruth's grandchildren, myself, my sister Sarah Thompson, my cousin Lila Copes, and my other cousin Linus Rachlis, about memories that we have about our baba. Linus remembers talking to Baba about his first computer programming job. He held the job for 3 summers, and to his chagrin, he never got a raise. So he shared this information with Baba, and she graciously offered to set up a scenario where Linus would practice asking for the raise with her. So they set this up, and Linus tried a few times, and just to no avail. Baba was encouraging, but she said, Linus, you need to be a little more assertive. So they tried a few more times, and she said, look, this is all wrong. What we should do is, I'll be Linus, and Linus, you can be your boss. So Baba asked Linus for the raise, and of course she got it. Baba was a strong woman. I remember going to Baba and Zeta's old house on Montrose every Friday night for Shabbat with my sister and my mom. And these are meaningful memories. They were nice evenings that we spent debriefing about our weeks, debating current events, and of course, eating some delicious food. Baba was known for her soups above all else, but the brownies and hamantaschen were good too. And as it so happens, I really like to cook now, and I think that that's probably attributable in large part to my Baba's influence. Like her, I think making dinner for friends and family is maybe the best way of bringing people together. Sarah remembers playing dress up with Baba. They would go in her closet, and a particular item of hers is significant. They were these golden shoes with sequins, and they were pretty garish. And Baba acknowledged that they really stuck out in her closet, which reflected her more practical, pragmatic nature. As Sarah grew up, the shoes were too big at first, and then for a short time fit her before she grew out of them. And she'll always remember dressing up in Baba's closet with her. Lila remembers the love that Baba and Zeta had for each other. As we all know, and as Richard mentioned, they were fortunate enough to spend around 70 years together. And growing up, when we spent time with the two of them, they were inseparable and always in love. At least once, Sarah and Lila dressed up as Baba and Zeta. Lila would put on the big aviator glasses and spread out the newspaper, and Sarah would put on the clip-on earrings and the turquoise top. To us, they were what a couple should aspire to be. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks, Samuel. Michael Rachlis.
I would also like to thank everybody who's here today. A testimony, I think, to the way that people felt about my mother. I'm going to talk a little bit about my mom's early life. Um, First of all, that her maiden name was Promislow. Interestingly, the name was actually bought sometime early in the 19th century by allegedly her great-grandfather, because at the time you could, if you only had one son, you were not eligible for the draft. So evidently the origin of the name Promislo is that way back when a relative of ours bought the name so his son could avoid the draft. Um, my mother's parents were Joseph and Leah. They came to Winnipeg in 1921, and they had 4 children, including my mother. My aunt Rebecca Rika, who unfortunately passed away in 1972. My uncle Henry, who passed away in 1997, and then my uncle Abby, who is alive and fairly well at 89 and living in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's very disappointed he was unable to attend today. My Zeta ran a general store in Quinton, Saskatchewan. Many of the small towns in Saskatchewan at that time had Jewish shopkeepers. I was giving a speech in Regina about 10 years ago, and I just asked anybody here from Quinton, and it turns out there was somebody who came up, talked to me afterwards, and remembered my Zeta very warmly, and that he was always giving extra candy to kids who, particularly if they couldn't afford it. He was an excellent chess player, once holding Bobby Fischer to a draw in a simultaneous match. And he was a Zeta par excellence, just everything you thought a Zeta should be. He let me beat him at chess. I thought that I was just a good chess player. Our Baba was the ultimate organizer, something she passed on to my mother. Watching old family movies, she's directing my Zeta, who's taking the pictures. It's quite a scene to watch as she's telling my aunt and uncle and everybody else to play their assigned roles. My mother attended the Isle Parish School, um, which was noted for being a Yiddish school, but also being one of quite left-wing um, variation. My mother actually began her day singing the International in Yiddish, and if she were given like a sip of a drink at a party later on, I recall, she could be provoked to singing it for others. Her family were labor Zionists and had strong values about equity. When Harry met Ruthie, my father attended public schools, but they met in high school. And in grade 10, my dad had a sinus operation. In retrospect, it sounds like it might not have been necessary and was a bit brutal. But he missed several weeks of school. When he got back to school, he was behind in math. My mother was excellent at math, and their teacher, Jack Silverberg, noting how far behind my father was, suggested that my mother tutor my father. And that's how their relationship started. When they were so they started going out when they were 15 or 16 years old. But of course, even for my parents, the path of true love did not always run straight. At one point, they had a bit of a spat. They didn't talk for a couple of days. My dad had a dog called Boots, so called because his coat was black, but his paws were white, and Boots had wandered over to my mother's house on Cathedral Avenue, so and would not go away. So my mother was forced to call my dad, tell him, "Your dog is here and he won't leave. Come and get him." And they got back together for the next 70 plus years. Ruth went to the University of Manitoba, starting a very long association with that institution. In fact, I'm wearing a University of Manitoba tie today to honor her long association of about 70 years with that institution. She graduated with a BA in 1947 with majors in Latin and math and a minor in chemistry. And of course, at that time, if you were a woman, that qualified you to be a social worker. And her first job was in 1947 in Dauphin, working in child welfare. and she stayed. I believe Dolly Chudnow is here today. Stayed with Dolly's family in Dauphin, and Dolly would relate that that's one of the main reasons why she went to social work herself. So, a little bit about my mom's impact on others. Um, my I've had just dozens of emails the last couple of days, and one of them I got this morning was from an ex-student of hers who I've done work with, and she said, "I remember your mom fondly as a gentle, elegant, and sharp-minded woman. She was a great teacher." And I think that I've heard that so many times from other students of hers. And I was inundated with notes from family, from her many cousins, nieces, and nephews. One said, referred to my mother as a caring, lovely individual with endless energy. Another noted that she was always there and always supportive, and that was a major theme in the notes that I received. Another said she was a warm and generous, and she was a great listener. And many people noted that she was really excellent listener and a wonderful person to turn to it for advice. And she always seemed to give good advice, but always somewhat indirectly by asking the right questions. Another cousin said, "Your mom was very dear to me and did so much for us. We are better for having had her in our lives and will forever hold her memory close." And that resonates very much for me too, her impact on me. I would say that my mother, with help from my father, instilled in me the spirit of tikkun olam, which literally is the responsibility we all have to heal the world. It's not necessarily with big actions, but just what we do every day with every person we interact with. So I'll leave it there and I'll let the rest of the story to my sister. Thank you.
I'm now going to ask Vivian to come up.
I'm turning to the one that says final draft. I'm so honored to be able to talk to you today about my mom, and I'm also incredibly nervous because the question is how you pull together the life of this remarkable woman in 10 minutes. No pressure. And many of you who are here, my colleagues in particular, have heard my 10-minute submissions that sometimes turn into a lot longer. So forgive me in advance for that. What I want to acknowledge is that there are so many here representing so many of the phases and aspects of my mother's life. And my job that I set for myself today is to try to pull together the different wonderful people that was my mother so that some of you that have a glimpse from one section can see my mom from another section of her life and maybe walk away with knowing a little bit more about this remarkable woman than you knew when you arrived here today. So I'm going to talk about my mother as these various people. And I'm going to not necessarily talk about it chronologically, but I'm hoping that by the end, all of these various stories fit together for you and you get a sense of this amazing life that my mother led. And so I'm going to pick it up where my brother left off with not my mother, the mother, but with my mother, the social worker, because that my mother's career had an extraordinary impact on me, um, as a professional, as someone that believes in community, that believes in and connecting the high values that we live with the small things that we should be thinking about every day and delivering on those values that we have. And I'm going to just, my mother had a very long career as a social worker and as a social work academic, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of her early jobs because I think they're very meaningful. The first job that my mother had as a social worker that I have only the most vague recollection of, and I can't remember whether it's my own recollection or my mother telling me these stories, is that my mother worked when she first returned to work when I was 3 years old in 1959 to what was then called the Logan Neighborhood House. And this was a settlement house for immigrants, as they were called, in the north uh, west part of the city near the CNR tracks. And it was actually an early variation on a family resource center, which is something that we're seeing springing up in Winnipeg now. And my mother, 2 half days a week, knocked on doors in that neighborhood. And when people opened their doors to her, she offered them services from social services that were available to them in in the neighborhood based setting that was that agency's a belief in how service was to be delivered. But what was significant about that for me was that my mother was in 1959 taking me to work with her to an on-site daycare, which we think is a pretty revolutionary idea now. In 1959, my mother brought me with her to work at Logan Neighborhood House for the 2 afternoons a week, and I attended nursery school there apparently. While she knocked on doors in the neighborhood and worked as a social worker. My mother also began work after taking a little bit of time back home, began work at what was the predecessor of today's Family Services of Winnipeg. It was then called Family Bureau. And my mother described this job to me once as her big break. And all I knew was that I could take the bus downtown to Edmonton and Graham and get a whole bunch of attention by all of the incredibly cool young social workers that lived there or that worked there in the 60s. Um, 2 jobs only that my mother had. My mother had other social work jobs. But for me, what was meaningful was that my mother brought together this incredible circle of her professional practice, her personal beliefs, her values. She lived her commitment to this community and her commitment in particular to what at that time probably would have been referred to as the needy of Winnipeg. And what an example she set for all of us. My mother then moved on when I was in late high school to academia, and she started university to get her graduate degree in social work just as I was finishing high school, and she graduated with her master's degree just as I was starting university. And again, it was pretty cool to have a mother when I started university, and again, University of Manitoba, so significant an institution to our family and to my mother. Kind of cool for my mother to have an office at the Psychological Service Center in the Fletcher Argue building at the university. Um, my mother graduated with her graduate degree in 1974 and started her almost 20-year career working as a field instructor, first of all, with the Faculty of Social Work, and then as a faculty member teaching courses at the Faculty of Social Work. Um, the My mother um, never um, she never thought about the jobs she had or the success she had as being something that puffed her up. It continued through her entire career to be all about her commitment to her profession, to her colleagues. She had the most collaborative approach to practicing social work, working with her colleagues, and ultimately delivering service in the best interests of her clients, something that I hope I've inherited in my job. Um, that's my mother, the social worker and the academic. And so I'm moving from that to my mother, the mother. My mother, the mother, had 3 children in 5 years and was done, had me when she was 29 years old. I hadn't started having children when I was 29 years old. I can't imagine having us 3 kids at the age of 29 and um, um, dealing with the things that we were up to as kids. Um, the thing about us 3 kids, my brother, my brother Fred, who as my brother indicated died many years ago, and myself, is that we're all incredibly different. My mother loved that about us. My mother loved the fact that we were individuals and encouraged us to set our own path. I do want to just stop for one more moment on my brother Fred, who died in 1994. Hope I got it right. Um, I want to acknowledge my brother's mental health challenges. He was diagnosed in his early 20s with schizophrenia. My parents never gave up on him, and my brother died in my parents' home, and my mother and my father were committed to giving Fred, improving his life, and allowing Fred to live his life as well as he did before he died at the untimely age of 42. My mother, the grandmother, Samuel's filled in on that. My mother, the grandmother, was never happiest than when she was with her 4 grandchildren, hopefully all in one room. And the Friday dinners at Montrose and at Hampton Green, as Samuel indicated, were pretty much a command performance. I think I, at one point, identified a yoga class that I wanted to do between 6 and 7 on Fridays. That was a non-starter. Um, but yeah, I appreciate that my mother brought that formality to the week, the focus to the week, that unfortunately many families don't have. And so we always knew that we got together on Friday nights. My mother always enjoyed every age and every stage, the footballs and the ballets and the plays. And when she returned from Toronto on her many trips there to visit her Toronto grandchildren, my brother's family, she regaled me with stories about what Linus and Lila were up to and how talented and smart they were. And I always loved hearing those stories. My mother, the family host slash matriarch slash organizer. My brother referred to my Baba Promislo. My mother inherited that. I think I may have a little bit of that. Um, we had the Rachlis boys, the 4 Rachlis boys. 3 of the 4 ended up in outside of Winnipeg as adults. My father was the only Rachlis remaining in Winnipeg. My uncle Hank Promislo and my mother were the 2 of the Promislo 4 that stayed in Winnipeg. And because my Uncle Hank and Aunt Helen lived on Enniskillen and we lived on Montrose, we had a North Pole, South Pole kind of thing happening in our family. And when my cousins would come from Vancouver or from my North Carolina cousins, who were, when I was really little, living in Kingston, Collins Bay, Ontario, my Rachlis cousins from Toronto and Ottawa, my 4-story rickety house, eccentric house on Montrose Street was the center of action. And There's so many stories there that I encourage you to approach me at the Shaftesbury afterwards, and I'll tell you about such things as the great liquid vitamin caper, the great frozen brownie caper, and I learned from Norm on Sunday that there's apparently the great alcohol caper, but I didn't know about that till Sunday, so I need to get more details from Norm. I was the youngest of all of the Promislow cousins, other than our North Carolina contingent, and I was in blissful ignorance about all these capers that were happening. But the point that I want to make about my mother is that we thought she didn't know about any of these shenanigans. She knew. She definitely, now that I'm a mother and do know everything that my kids have been up to, my mother totally knew about all these capers, and she enjoyed our antics profoundly. Even the calling in to CKRC to vote for the Ventures Walk Don't Run as the song of the day, Norm. Um, the other thing about my mother, the grandmother, is the annual Hamantaschen mailer. My mother, as a academic, had reading break in February off, a perfect time with Purim coming up to bake dozens and dozens of Hamantaschen and to send them through Canada Post, which apparently still existed at that time. Uh, that the Hamantaschen went all over Canada and the US to my cousins and to her siblings, and no one ever said that they didn't arrive intact. And I don't want to know if those Hamantaschen arrived in pieces. My mother, the organizer's final act was to somehow um, die Sunday in an incredibly well organized and peaceful manner. Many of you know that my mother has been ill, um, very ill for a couple of months, and she she her death occurred peacefully and conveniently um, for for me, for my father. My mother somehow um, telegraphed that her death should occur during the 20 minutes of the day that the visiting palliative care nurse would be there. Um, I've talked to Richard about these things, and he tells me that he hears these stories, and he's given up thinking that things like this are coincidences. I've only got a couple of more. My mother, the creative retiree. I've got a bunch of notes, and will be, it'll be sundown if I talk about everything that my mother did as a creative retiree. She retired in 1991, 2 or 3 weeks before Samuel was born. She thought that was a good time to spend even more time with a grandchild, and she just took off when she retired. If she was an incredible person when she had her social work career and her academic career, the aqua sizes, the 3 choirs, the working to get social workers as a regulated profession in Manitoba with the Manitoba Institute of Registered Social Workers, now the College of Social Workers of Manitoba, her book club, um, her, did I mention her 3 choirs? And she just is a role model for anyone, like any of us here, that are approaching that time of our life with, what the heck am I going to do? Just take a leaf from my mother's book. Um, I want to talk also about my mother, the ever humble, the grateful person, the person that had no sense of entitlement, and always was always saying thankful and thank you. And this is my opportunity to thank a few people. My mother taught us to not taking anything for granted, to be gracious, thankful, and on her behalf, I would like to express our profound gratitude for just a couple of people in her life, but there were so many, many that took great care of my mother with much caring and much generosity. First of all, my mother's nurse practitioner, Jane McDonald, at the WRHA Cordon Clinic, who made many, many house calls as my mother's primary care provider for many, many years, and was endlessly compassionate as my mother's health deteriorated, especially over the last 6 months. I want to also thank, on behalf of the family, Dr. Bruce Martin, a wonder, a palliative care doctor, and the compassionate and highly skilled nurses of the WRHA's home palliative care program, who visited my mother every day and who helped us support our wife, our mother, in her end of life journey, the end of life, the journey that she made at home. I'd like to thank, on our family's behalf, nurses Jan and Wendy at the Shaftesbury Park residence, who were wonderful to my mother as well. And I want to thank our incredibly dedicated, compassionate, skilled healthcare attendants who looked after my mother under the supervision of Esther. And I want to name them by name: Jeanette, Lisa, Matthew, and Lily. Lily and Richard, the registered nurse with the WRHA Palliative Care Program, my dad, and I were at my mother's side when she breathed her last peaceful breath on Sunday. Thank you for all of your interest in my mom and for coming today. And thank you, Richard. What can we say about Richard? There has been a long, strong family connection with Richard and John. And I want to thank you for everything you've done and continue to do for our family. My mother loved you so much. Richard is honoring us here today with his 4th family funeral in our family. Finally, I want to leave you with the topic 7 and last, my mother's big question. And I talked about this 10 years ago when my mother was honored by the then Manitoba Institute of Registered Social Workers for being Social Worker of the Year. And when I made a few remarks at that event, I talked about the question that my mother always encouraged me to ask when I didn't understand a situation, when I felt there was just too much conflict, too much sadness, people were behaving unreasonably, and I couldn't figure it out. And my mother encouraged me to ask the question, what do you think is going on for that person right now? And the social workers, and I know there's social workers in the group today, will understand that question, because this is probably a question that social workers are taught to ask at the beginning of their program, but my mother passed that on to me. And I want to thank my mother for teaching me to always ask the question of what is going on for that other person. And when you ask that question, suddenly your path becomes clear. The world is a better place. You can resolve conflict, and you can make your way. Mom, I will always love you and miss you with all my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Before we conclude the service with the El Malay Rachamim, I'm just going to make a few announcements. Burial will follow immediately after the service at the Sherezetic Cemetery on Armstrong Avenue. I am assuming that the procession will proceed directly north on Main Street with a left turn onto Armstrong and then a right turn into the cemetery. Please use your flashing lights, but please also heed traffic signals. Following the burial, the meal of consolation will be held at the Shaftesbury Park Retirement Residence, second floor library. Shaftesbury is located at 905 Shaftesbury, just south of Grant. Shiva will be observed tomorrow at the Shaftesbury, Wednesday, from 2 to 4 in the afternoon and from 7 to 9 in the evening. Please rise. El Malay Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hametzeh Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Ashchina Im Kedoshim U'Taharim Kezohar Arakim Mazehirim Et Nishmat Ruth bat Yaakov Yosef Leah Shehalecha Leolama Al Harachamim Yastireha Beseter Kenafav Leolamim V'yitzror ha'chaim et nishmata V'yitzror ha'chaim et nishmata Adonai hu nachalata v'tanuach b'shalom al mishkavav v'nomar Amen. O God, full of compassion, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest under the wings of your presence to our loved one, Ruth, daughter of Yaakov, Yosef, and Leah, who has entered eternity. Master of mercy, let her find refuge forever in the shadow of your wings, and let her soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. The eternal God is her inheritance. May she rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. Please remain standing while the pallbearers take their places. and please remain in your places until the family and I have exited. Thank you again for being here.